There was an amendment put in to the resolution today about David Davis saying his comments that he made risk undermining the good faith that has been built during the negotiations. What do you think about that?
Well, I understand that, given that an agreement had been reached and then over the weekend he seemed to pour cold water on it and distance himself from it having any significance. I can understand that colleagues from the rest of Europe are a little bit alarmed by that.
Do you think people are pretty angry here in the European Parliament at David Davis's comment, really, which seemed to undermine the good faith and the good relationship that had been built on Friday?
Yes, some colleagues were very angry about it, others just rolled their eyes in exasperation. So there was a range of views, but none of them were particularly positive.
Do you think it's damaged the mood around the negotiations significantly, or do you think it's something both parties will move on from?
Well, I know he's tried to row back from that since then, but people do look at the wider picture as well, and they hear, for instance, that the UK government has not yet discussed at cabinet level what it wants to secure as the end product of these negotiations. That's quite astonishing 18 months after the referendum. They also heard about the impact assessment saga, that actually we're going into these negotiations blind. We've not done an impact assessment on the cost of leaving the customs union, on what Brexit will do to agriculture, to industry, to finance. It's really quite amazing.
One of the points that you made today was about the agreement on citizens' rights, which you say still leaves people facing uncertainty. What do you mean by that?
Well, because it depends on the final agreement being reached. Until that happens, if there is no final deal, everything that's been agreed on citizens' rights falls down. Unlike what was agreed on Ireland, where there is a sentence in there that says that whatever happens in terms of future agreements, these agreements will still stand. They didn't put that in for citizens.
Prime Minister Theresa May, though, has made it very clear that the security and safety of the citizens, both UK and EU and EU and UK, are priority for her to ensure that there is stability and security for them. Do you really think she'd row back on that if the deals didn't go as smoothly as possible?
Well, if there isn't a final deal, all the provisions in there that safeguard their rights that exist under EU law, with the special protections under EU law that are enshrined in the agreement, including possibility to invoke the Court of Justice to protect them if need be, that would all fall down, wouldn't it?
So let's just look at the transition period, because that's obviously the next step in terms of agreeing this 2-year possibly transition period for the UK and the EU. Do you think that it's in the bag, the sense that the EU is going to be happy with a, let's say, 2-year transition period, and it could be resolved and agreed to by as early as January?
It depends on Britain. Because if Britain is accepting that during a transition period it will remain in the single market, the customs union, and follow all the rules, then I don't think it's a problem for the EU. What the EU will say is if the UK wants only some things but not others, or wants some special rules for the UK during that transition period that need to be negotiated, then it becomes that much more difficult.
What we're talking about then is a cliff edge Brexit, effectively, so at the end, March 2019, it's just suddenly the UK leaves. Do you really think the EU or the UK are going to actually let that happen? And if we take Manfred Weber's saying, in fact, it's entirely conditional on progress being made in the next phase of the talks, do you think that's just a bit of a bluff, and in reality no one's going to not want to see a transition period in place?
Nobody wants the cliff edge scenario of leaving without a deal, because that's a nightmare scenario. Nobody except, that is, I get the impression, some people in the Conservative Party who fear that any deal will keep Britain closely aligned with EU rules on consumer protection, workers' rights, environmental standards, which is exactly what they dislike about the EU. The neoliberal right wants to break away from the EU. That's why they wanted Brexit in the first place, to escape those sort of rules. They want a free-for-all in the market.
One thing that the resolution does say is that the resolution that's been written down and passed today doesn't indicate what position the Parliament will take when it comes to the consent procedure on their final withdrawal agreement, implying therefore that despite the positive message of the resolution today, the Parliament might, down the line, vote against the final withdrawal agreement. Do you think it's ever likely that the European Parliament would ever vote down the agreement negotiated by both parties?
Well, you can't bind yourself in advance to vote for an agreement that you've not yet seen. And of course the European Parliament might reject the agreement. The British Parliament might, in fact, probably more likely to reject the agreement. The European Parliament probably won't if it's been signed up to by by the 27 member states, but it might if it thinks citizens' rights haven't been adequately protected, for instance.
So if everything is conditional up until that final agreement is made, and anyone can veto at any point and anyone can pull away at any point, what's been the point of this whole phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, where we've guaranteed certain things in phase 1 so we can go on to phase 2? If everything's still going to be up in the air.
This is perfectly normal in negotiations. You have to put one subject to bed after another and after another till you get the whole thing. But you still need to formally then adopt the whole thing. This is true for any international treaty, by the way. When the British Parliament votes or the European Parliament votes on an international agreement, that's after it's been negotiated step by step, subject by subject. That's perfectly normal.